I want to welcome everyone this evening. We are so very, very excited to have the National Museum for American Indian, the Smithsonian's Museum, joining us to share with us information about Native Knowledge 360. And I will admit that I am so excited to learn about this as well. This is something that will be great, a great tool for you to use as educators as you tackle some specific topics. So I want to introduce you to our presenters this evening. Renee Goki is with us, and then also we have Bert Correa, who will be assisting her. And so I will let them tell you a little bit more about what they do there at the Smithsonian and fill us in on all the details. So Renee, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kay, for organizing this and having us. And I don't know, Bert, if you want to introduce yourself really quick too, I invite you to, but no pressure. Bert is our
Hi, yes. Happy to.
Hi,
Sorry
Bert.
about that. Hi, so my name is Bert Correa. I'm Taino. I work here in New York in the education department and assist Renee with putting teacher workshops and other programs together. So it's really nice to be here. And thank you all for having us.
Thanks, Bert. And I just, before we start out, I want to just mention that we have an Indigenous Peoples Day teach-in coming up. So we invite you to come to that, and Bert will be presenting about his Taino culture and background and have some ideas for the classroom. So we invite you to that, and I'll make sure you get a link to that as well if you don't have one already. So I'll just start by saying hato, hello everybody. Hako wesila samamo, which means how are you breathing? It's a traditional greeting in the Shawnee language. I hope everyone is calm, relaxed, and that you are doing well today. I'm coming in today from my home in Fairfax City in Virginia. So I live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma. And I'm also Ukrainian and English on my mom's side. So all of these things, you know, being a mother and a museum educator for almost over 20 years now, all kind of shapes my worldview. And so I really feel that my role is to be in service to all of you. So I'm really grateful for what you do every day in the classroom. I'm glad to be here. I'd like to start by just asking you, we're going to use the chat a lot today, and Kay is graciously going to help me. Well, Bert will be putting resources in, and Kay will be helping be my voice if I can't always get to reading all of the chat. So we're going to be active on chat, so do keep that open, please. And I'd like to hear from you. Where do you say you're from and why? I was going to ask what you teach and that, but you know what? I think that this will serve us well for our next bit. So I'd love to hear a little bit about where you say you're from and why. Because I know most of you are secondary teachers and I got your subjects already. Okay. Let's see, I can see some of this.
Have to type your answer. It gives a new meaning to wait time.
I see Jim saying something. Okay, so I saw Lexington, Kentucky. I'll go with that first one. It was where I was born and where I grew up and have spent most of my life. Yeah.
Grace says, I'm from Chicago and I'm in Lexington. Since that is my hometown, when I'm vacation, I say Kentucky.
Mm. Side.
Central Kentucky, because it doesn't place me in my, I'm trying to read them and there's a little block of it. Central Kentucky, because it doesn't place me in my small town. So instead of saying a town, we say Central Kentucky. Mount Vernon, the exit you get off to go to Lake Cumberland. And because the Ohio Navy always joins us. Lexington, because it's where I reside. I'm from Barberville, Kentucky, Orland, Kentucky. Oh, I'm sorry, Orlando, Kentucky. Kentucky, because it's the best. Lexington, Kentucky. I'm from Ohio because it's where I spent my formative years, even though I have spent more time living in Kentucky than Ohio. Others are apologizing. They're trying to get kids out of the building. So just bear with some of those. Here's another one. I'm from West Liberty, Kentucky in Morgan County. It's where I'm from and have always lived. And it's where my family is.
Great. Thank you all for sharing. It's interesting how, it's such a big part of who we are, and it can change and shift depending on who we're talking to, depending on the context. If they know Kentucky, you might say your smaller town, and if not, then you might just say Kentucky. And a lot of what some of you are saying is around the fact that it was your formative years, you grew up there. So that's also part of who you are. So I always think that that's just really interesting to think about where people are from and how they identify as part of who they are and who we are. And so I want to start, as we often do, with gratefully acknowledging the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we are and we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. So as with our in-person programs, we often continue to do this work to acknowledge that all of us are on Indigenous land, whether we're in Kentucky or across the river in Ohio, and throughout these lands that we call a lot of times Turtle Island, our collective lands here, and also up north in Canada and all the way to the Arctic Circle and down through the Caribbean, Central and South America. These are Indigenous peoples who have stewarded these lands for thousands of years. So it's really important to acknowledge that. And we do have some guidance that Bert is putting in the chat if land acknowledgements might be new to you, or you might want to, learn more about them. We have a helpful handout, which is a one-page guide that could help steer you, but also give you some background. And one of the things that I like to recommend is, I think it's best to never do things from obligation. So I think it's always important to consider that this is just a first step in creating relationships. So rather than having necessarily just a public way of doing it, it's important to really think about what a land acknowledgement would mean in your own context and your own experience. And so, there are diverse and vibrant Native communities throughout Kentucky and throughout the United States, what we call now the United States today. And for many Indigenous people, belonging is deeply tied to ancestral homelands, through relationships with the environment, through memories that have been forged and built through family and cultural experiences lived over millennia. And as you know, likely thousands of Native people were removed from the United States, including in Ohio. As my people were, we had a reservation in Ohio, and my tribe, the Shawnee, were forcibly removed in an act of ethnic cleansing from those lands. So it's important to acknowledge that even if you don't feel that there are a lot of Native people in your state, that there are contemporary Native people and that there's a history there, and they may have been removed from those lands. And we have some resources that we think will really help support teaching a fuller picture of that, which you'll learn about later. So just a little background here. The National Museum of the American Indian, or NMAI for short, has 3 facility locations. We have on the left the office where I work and where our presenter, Colleen Smith, who will do the next session, we both work in that office on the National Mall, and it's right across from the United States Capitol. And that was purposeful. Because it shows that we have a nation-to-nation relationship with the United States government as citizens of tribal nations. Additionally, we have this facility in the center, our New York City facility in Lower Manhattan, and that's where Bert and our supervisor Johanna work. And finally, on the right-hand side is the heart of the museum, in my opinion, the Cultural Resources Center. And this is where we steward over 800,000 cultural objects, including archives and photographs and textiles and contemporary art that's in our care. So I say we steward it because our philosophy is really that these objects belong to Indigenous people, and it's really our role to connect them back to the Indigenous communities. So by being here and part of this workshop, teachers like you are really contributing to the newly adopted vision of the museum. Now, our mission's been the same. It's about partnership with Native people, but our vision is fairly new. And this says the equity and social justice for Native peoples of the Western Hemisphere through education, inspiration, and empowerment. So that is our hope. That is our kind of our vision for the work that we're doing. And Native Knowledge 360 is a big part of that. So we call it NK360 for short. It's our national education initiative that's designed to transform teaching and learning about Native Americans. And we understand that this work doesn't happen overnight. It is a generational process, but we're already starting to see, and it's from a variety of factors, not this national, education initiative, but a variety of factors. Society is ready to tell more complete narratives. There have been racial reckonings. There's a lot happening in our country, and people know that there's other stories out there to be told that haven't been told. And so I think that we're really ripe in society for this transformation to happen, and we're seeing some changes. So that's pretty exciting. Today, we're going to look at a few common stories or narratives that we have here in specifically the United States, and find ways to tell more complete narratives about Indigenous people. So this workshop is foundational. It's actually, you're the first group that's really gotten it in a public setting. So I ask for your grace ahead of time. I already know there's some changes to make, and you can tell me on the evaluation too. So that'll be really helpful. But this introductory workshop that we've been developing seeks to connect you to our essential understandings through to classroom lessons and resources, and some pedagogical approaches that work towards transforming teaching and learning. So we have a few learning objectives here. First, we hope that you'll consider how to use intentional and purposeful language, that words have power, and consider those in your classroom towards sharing more accurate representations and more complete narratives about history and contemporary Native life in your classroom. So one big takeaway is that we really suggest working towards talking about Native people as alive and vibrant today. Although our cultures have changed a great deal, we are contemporary people as well. So not only are we people of the past, and finally, to teach this idea of diversity. So we hope that we'll give you some ideas on how to do that and show that there is no one Native American or one experience. We hope that you'll understand the importance of countering false or incomplete narratives with more complete narratives. And we'll hear from you a little bit on the reasons why it might be important to address contemporary Native life in your classroom. Finally, we're going to share some NK360 lessons. I already know that this workshop, in 1 hour or so doesn't go as deep as we'd like. And so I already think that your session with Colleen will allow you a chance to kind of dig into the lessons more as she shares the essential understandings framework and some cross-disciplinary approaches to that. We also want to connect you with amazing cultural objects and primary sources to create meaningful and relevant teaching moments. So we feel that the museum really does have a lot to offer in that way. And a lot of times people just don't know about them because it takes a long time to find them sometimes. So considerations for our session today, I'm just gonna maybe mention one or two of these. First off, I like to say that, I hope that you feel comfortable asking questions, that you have, that you stay curious. Feel free to use the chat. I may not be able to answer every question in this particular session, but we do go back and try and provide some answers if we don't have time for them here. I also want to mention that, this is a learning process for everybody. And so it's also a learning process for me. I'm not an expert. There are hundreds of different tribes, I think 574 currently in the United States. So I certainly have a lot to learn about different tribes. And so this is really an opportunity for us to all kind of learn together. Oh, and I should have mentioned that grace part. Please have some grace for our session today because we're still working on it. So here's a quick agenda. We have an introduction to NMAI and NK360, which I sort of gave. We're going to cycle through a process that looks at false, incomplete, and more complete narratives. And we're going to do that by modeling a look at terminology and the impact of words and how we can tell, more complete narratives when thinking about terminology, and provide some guidance on how to do that. And we're going to dive into some Thanksgiving narratives, because we know that that is a very common place where it's kind of one of the origin stories here in the United States that is often used and talked about. And so we'll look at that as a narrative and think about ways to tell more accurate stories around that and some strategies there. And I started the American Indian removal because I have removed part of that presentation from today, because I really think it deserves more time. And I've asked Colleen to really dig into that with you at session 2. So next, I just want to introduce you to an important framework. Some of you may have already had a chance to look at this. We sent it in advance. It's called our Framework for Essential Understandings About American Indians. And this framework follows the 10 themes from the National Council for the Social Studies. So it's built around those same 10 themes that you might be familiar with on a national level. And what we've done is just developed some language and framing and ways of thinking about Native peoples or American Indians with some key concepts. So for example, the first theme in the National Council for Social Studies is around culture. So we developed one around American Indian cultures, and I've just pulled out 3 key concepts that are important to keep in mind and that I think relate to today's session. 1, there is no single American Indian culture or language, which I kind of alluded to earlier. 2nd, American Indians are both individuals and members of a tribal group. So, I can't speak for all people in the Eastern Shawnee tribe where I'm enrolled. I can't speak even for all people in my family. So we're both individuals, but we're also members of a tribal group. So it's important to realize that there's not one person that can kind of speak on behalf of all people. And 3rd, American Indian cultures have always been dynamic and changing. So a lot of times people will say, oh, you don't look American Indian, or how much are you really? And it's important to know that we have a long history and that, we're not just one thing. A lot of us, we have a lot of, as I mentioned, I'm Ukrainian English. We have a lot of, different backgrounds that all feed into who we are. And Native cultures are no different and don't exist in a vacuum. So there's not sort of a pure Native American culture. Tribes have been sharing ideas, exchanging goods, and stuff for many, many years. So that is kind of how culture really works. And American Indian cultures are no different. We're inspired by one another. And so I'd like to turn it to you, because I've been doing a lot of talking. Has someone ever worked really hard to spell or pronounce your name correctly? How did it make you feel? And we don't necessarily have to go through all of these. I do want to honor everyone's time. And I think it's really nice to hear from everyone, but while people are writing, I noticed, Kay, that you, before we started, went back to Bert and asked, how to pronounce his last name. So I think that's a great example. And I don't know if anybody else wants to share. They serve valued. Good. Names matter.
And may I ask a question? May they turn on their mic and talk as well as just the chat, or would you prefer them just to use the chat?
I think it's fine with me. Yeah.
Well, my last name is Hedrick, and every time someone says it, they try to put an N in it or an S on the end, and it has neither.
Okay, I'll share. Growing up, no one could pronounce my name because I'm from a small town in Kentucky, but my last name was Italian, and because my dad is Italian, and it's Volpe. Volpe, and we got everything in the world except for Volpe. So it was very difficult. Now I'm a Russell and life is easier.
Thank you for sharing. Does somebody want to add, how did it make you feel when someone took that time to pronounce your name correctly? or to, yeah, to double
Jamie,
check.
Jamie has already put in the chat. She says she doesn't have really issues with her name, but her students tell her how much they appreciate it when she pronounces their names correctly.
Yeah. Yes, that's great. I think it's so important, and it just makes us feel honored. It makes us feel acknowledged. It makes us feel more visible, and really important in the classroom too for our students. So thank you for sharing. So we're going to move on to this new sort of approach that we're taking, that we've been developing around the first stage of this is around sparking inquiry. So I wanted to ask, and I understand that, please feel free to ask a question that you have around Native American terminology. Is there one question that you have? Maybe it's a collective term. Is it, do I use Native American? Is it American Indian? Does anybody have a question around that?
I have one. So a lot of the sources that we use, when we're speaking, we'll use words like Native American, Indigenous, things of that nature. But when you look at some of our sources that are maybe older, you'll see the word Indian on there, or American Indian. Should we be trying to censor that? Should we just give kids the disclaimer, hey, this is obviously an old source and that's why it's phrased the way that it is? What's the terminology that would be correct for that?
That's such a great question. So this is probably the most common question we get from teachers and from the general public is it American Indian? Is it Native American, Indigenous? You could use our helpful handout that we have on this. And I think Bert's going to be able to put that in the chat. It's called The Impact of Words. And it gives a little bit of history on how these terms came to be. And so that might be a starting place for background. And I might, what I'm going to do, instead of telling you what you should do, I'll tell you what I do. I use them interchangeably, and I try and talk with teachers, and this is what we'll do today a little bit, is talk about kind of the origin of the words and how some of them came to be. So that may be something that you might consider with your own students, is kind of understanding where some of these terms came from. So thanks for sharing that really important question, and even taking it the next step and asking what you should do with your students. So, sorry if that's a bit of a non-answer, but one of the approaches that we think is really important to mention is that learning is not linear. So as we learn more, we'll develop new questions or deeper questions. You've asked a deeper question about what you should then do with your students. So we hope that this invitation to ask questions and be curious, and all things that you model with your students, I'm sure help to spark inquiry in that cycle of learning. And so that's kind of where this process that we've been working on begins, is with sparking inquiry. So let's kind of go through it a little bit. Let's examine the term Indian and find out a little bit more about where it even comes from. So you see here a primary source. It is, a familiar refrain that we've all heard, or at least I've heard, is Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So it's a common rhyme that I kind of grew up with. And this, what you're looking at here, is a journal entry from Christopher Columbus, or Cristobal Colon in Spanish. And it's the first instance where the indigenous people were called Indians in a written form that we know of. So Indian is a generic kind of misnomer. It's a misapplication. They were not Indians. That is still used sometimes today. It is not, I will say it's a little complicated. So Native people themselves, my grandma grew up saying Indian herself, rather than saying Shawnee. So I think some of this is generational. It's sort of like what people grow up with. And so I think we'll see across generations that the words, may change over time. I always do say that they're all acceptable. I mean, Indian is technically a misnomer. And Native American can be a little bit I guess, opaque too, because, you know, some people say, well, I'm Native American because I was born here. So it's that can have a little bit of, you know, variance on how whose point of view is being provided. But they're both acceptable. They're not offensive terms, at least in my book. But what we suggest is really to ask people themselves what collective term they prefer. And I think today I will say that a lot of people are moving towards Indigenous because it doesn't, you know, it's not an misnomer like Indians is, and it can't sort of be misconstrued like Native American. So I want to turn it back to you again and ask you to very simply, we're on our next step, which is kind of this false or misleading narrative section. I'd like you to use the chat to just simply describe what you think is a false narrative. It could just be one word, like untrue, or another word. What is a false narrative? And as you're thinking about your word or a short phrase, you can be general, like something like untrue, or you could be specific if you want to get into that, but that's a little harder in the chat.
So do you want to hear some of them?
Please.
Fake, one-sided, unreliable, inflammatory, misleading, fake story, lie. Fact, people think it's true, but it's not. And
Wow.
fact is in quotes.
That's great. Okay, thank you all. Wonderful. So, you know, you've said most of these things and a lot more, but, you know, untrue can be stereotypical, misleading history, and it can even be dehumanizing sometimes when you're talking about different groups of people. And you all added so many really important additions to that, to false narratives. So, you know, we looked at Columbus's journal from October of 1492. Now here we are in 1916. And we have a textbook that again is mentioning Columbus, which is one of, you know, we were talking about one of the epitomes of an kind of origin story of this land, and one that's told again and again, and shapes what we remember and think about with history. And it says here in 1916 in this older textbook that Columbus, supposing he had reached the Indies or Southeastern Asia, called the savages who met him Indians. North America was almost an empty continent waiting for the white man to come and fill it with people. So we've moved from, you know, Indian to now, you know, a very biased term, dehumanizing term, savages. And we're hearing other things about, you know, that are false, right? That it was an empty continent and things like that. So we see this language institutionalized in our schools through this particular textbook, and clearly savage is a discriminating and racist term. But what about the term Indian? Is it false, or is it just incomplete? So let's talk a little bit. And I don't necessarily have all the answers. Let's talk a little bit about what an incomplete narrative is. We talked about false. So what is an incomplete narrative? How would you describe that? I guess, especially in relation to, you know, the difference between a false narrative. What is a characteristic of an incomplete narrative, please? Partial picture, one-sided, not enough information, missing parts. Yeah, those are all great. That's right. So an incomplete narrative is not specifically offensive. It could be, but not always. But it's not the whole story either. As you mentioned in the chat, it's missing parts. It's one-sided. it might lack depth, and almost certainly does. And often in relation to teaching about Native people, it lacks Native perspectives. Or if it does include a Native perspective, it might just provide one singular perspective that's supposed to speak on behalf of all Native people. So it's really important to think about adding many different Native voices to our resources and our classrooms. And it can just be kind of generic. Okay. So now we have a textbook example here from 2008. And it says, when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, Native Americans had been living in the Americas for tens of thousands of years. In what is now Mexico and Peru, complex civilizations had developed. But these civilizations were unprepared for the Spanish attacks that began in the early 16th century. This is where it would have been fun to do a poll. It would have been, I think I might have to build that in, because it would have been nice to ask you, and you can use the chat if you like, do you think, where does this fall? Would you consider this a false narrative? And if you can use a textual evidence of why you're if you say false, what about this text is making you say that? Or is it incomplete, And again, what part of this makes you think it's simply incomplete? Or is it a more complete narrative? And you think that it belongs in that category? And then what is the textual evidence of that?
We actually have a person who said in the chat, Donna here, actually had this textbook as a student in middle school.
Oh, wow.
So it says it's incomplete because it minimizes the why.
Interesting. Yeah. Minimizes the why. And the why being around Columbus's arrival. Can I ask you to say a little bit more about that? Or is the why around something else?
Oh, the why was around, like it says, but these civilizations were unprepared for the Spanish attacks. Like the why they were unprepared for people they had not been around, like with the diseases and with the various weapons that they had. It just minimizes the why they were unprepared, and it just kind of brushes over it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it dehumanizes them as if they were, in the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm jotting this down. Mm-hmm.
And another person in the chat has said, incomplete, it's minimizing other aspects of what happened, like disease. And it doesn't celebrate the complex civilizations.
Yeah. Yep. And I think, too, it's sort of who decides who's civilized. I mean, I think there's a Western standard that says this is civilization, right? Like democracy, a lot of these ideas come from the Greeks and then the Romans, that built on those ideas. But, there are ideas around democracy that have existed in these lands by some of the Haudenosaunee people for a very long time. It's just one example. But my point is larger than that, who decides what is civilized and, what standard are people, adhering to? And also Mexico and Peru are mentioned. But I would argue that there were other complex civilizations as well, depending on, that right here in Ohio, across the river from you in Ohio, we had really sophisticated earthworks that aligned with different events, astronomical events in the sky and the equinoxes and the solstices, and, had great health and wellness. So is health and wellness, is that a marker of a sophisticated civilization? Is happiness? Is it material? So those are some of the, sorry, I'm getting a little philosophical, but those are some of the things that, we need to think about too. Okay, but back to this, I think all of you, have really good answers about, the lack of writing or saying that they're unprepared and not mentioning disease, right? So we're just hearing part of the story. Okay, so now we're on to more complete narratives. And I'd like you to use the chat again. What are characteristics of a more complete narrative, would you say?
tells multiple sides, multiple perspectives. And we're seeing that repeated over and over again.
Mhm.
Intentionally trying to get the full story, multiple perspectives and opinion. And I would say possibly some objectivity. All parties involved are afforded the opportunity to be a voice, something that shows all sides with details, thoughts, feelings, and motives.
Ooh, this is great. I'm jotting this down. I really need to expand these words.
Here's another: to understand, not to influence the way others think. Includes the perspectives of voices not often heard.
That's great.
And
Thank you
it's
all.
unbiased.
That's a hard one. Because I'm not neutral, right? And we're not, we wish we were neutral in the classroom, but we're not, because we're human beings and we have feelings and thoughts and motives and details in our lives that all shape, kind of how we see it. But that doesn't mean just because we're not neutral as human beings that we can't tell more complete narratives, right? And that we can't bring in all these diverse perspectives and things that you are all mentioning, create and make up a more complete narrative. So I would just add rich, diverse perspectives, individual stories. And some of you mentioned, hearing from other people, multidimensional identity, that, they're not just kind of one blanket answer for something, that things are a little bit complex sometimes. It might be, especially in relation to Native people, including contemporary. Anytime there's, often Native people are pulled back into history in the curriculum. So making sure that you counter that with the Native people have resilience and are still here is really important. And finally, and one of you alluded to this, that if you have enough voices in the kitchen or enough voices around the table, the accounts can actually vary and contradict each other because you've got more voices there. And so it's not as it's clean and tidy sometimes as something that's false and just, it's a little more complicated, but you're adding more voices. So you're getting closer to more complete narratives. And notice that we don't say complete narratives, we say more complete, because there's, always room to learn more. So back to our helpful handout that Bert dropped in the chat. We have a guidance sheet that helps you just keep some things in mind that we hope is helpful. Avoid generalization and use conditional language. So an example, not the Native Americans or all Native Americans, but maybe many Native Americans. So things like that are helpful. Use present tense and contemporary examples. And of course, refrain from using terminology and phrases that perpetuate stereotypes. So like savages and that kind of stuff is, some of the worst stuff that we can do, because it can be really harmful to Native kids and non-Native kids, because it limits people's understanding of each other. And I liked what one of you said, that you basically speak to be heard rather than to understand. And I think that's a really powerful idea. So what we suggest is ask people in groups which terms they prefer, and maybe they'll even pronounce it for you. And if you need pronunciation again, a lot of times people are willing to do that. And I will say that a lot of our materials that you're going to learn about more with Colleen, a lot of them have pronunciations, which is really something that we find teachers say is very helpful to them. So there's a lot of audio that's built into a lot of our things. An example of learning myself, just yesterday, I called up the Salish people, and they're in Montana, because we have a picture of Elder Stephen Small Salmon. He's a fluent Salish speaker, and he works at the Insquam Salish School in Montana. So I had to ask, because I've seen the word, as you can see here, for years, but I wanted to make sure I was saying it right. So there's always opportunities to do that. So hopefully that's helpful. And now let's turn it to the other side of the Columbus story, which is the Taino people. So they are an indigenous people of the Caribbean, and they were the first indigenous people of the Americas to encounter Europeans at Cristobal Colon in 1492, when he came onto the island of what's now called Hispaniola, which is modern day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The Taino have a rich culture, and as I mentioned earlier, we invite you to our upcoming teach-in on October 1st, where my colleague Bert, who's in the chat, will be presenting much more. But this map, I think, is just a start to kind of talk about that. These are the lands of the Taino people. Another important aspect of this is, of course, to include pictures and photographs of people. And when we're talking about more complete narratives, I think all of us can think back in our minds to like an Edward Curtis photo, you know, of a Native American off of their stage, you know, with one singular leader, often male, who's depicted. And really there's women and children and families that, you know, doing more everyday things that are really important as well to show, to kind of counter that singular narrative. Beyond being taught that Columbus, quote, discovered the Americas and encountered the, quote, Indians, if we are taught about Tainos at all, that's my hound dog in the back, sorry, we're taught that they're extinct sometimes, which is completely false, not true. So showing Native people as alive and vibrant and colorful pictures and diverse helps us to tell more complete narratives as well. And a lot of our resources have photographs, videos, and things like that. Okay, so let's reflect for just a minute. It's correct terminology and or strive to pronounce people's names correctly. And we kind of talked about this, but I'd love if you have anything to add to that. It'd be great to hear from you.
Goes back to the idea that words have meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, they have meaning, they have importance, and they're parts of our identity, kind of what we're, you know, our names are important. They have stories behind them. Your students, all of their names have stories. You have either our first, middle, or last name. Surely there's a story in there. So it's about who we are. And so it is really important, not only on an individual level, but, you know, with Indigenous people, instead of this kind of Indians general thing. And I know sometimes we need to use that because it's a collective term. And sometimes we're speaking collectively, but if you can, or when you can, using terms that are, you know, the Salish people or the Taino or the Shawnee, because we're so different from one another. You know, the Salish have their own language and their own history and experiences in Montana today, very different than Bert's community in Puerto Rico and the modern communities in New York City, where he lives now, and throughout the United States, and then our Shawnee people too. So it just helps us tell a little bit more of a complete narrative. All right, so I'm going to turn it back to you. When was the first time you learned about American Indians? And if it was a Columbus story, skip over that one and think of your second. Who taught you and what did you learn? And check the time.
Thanksgiving. Seems to be the one that's coming up.
Okay.
The movies. Someone else says the movies. And I would think that that would be a big one. The American Western was very popular when many of us were children. Third grade, we had to learn about different tribes and the types of shelters or homes they had.
Yeah.
Trail of Tears.
So, yep, these are all very common and the same types of things that that I grew up with too, in public school, kind of the stories that were told, what was in the textbook or the activities that you might have done at certain types of the year. So the topic of Thanksgiving for many of us, especially young people in the classroom or even new immigrants to this country, often that can be kind of one of the first introductions to this national holiday. Might be one of the first introductions to Native Americans or Indians that a lot of us receive. So it comes up early in the classroom and it comes up often. It's an annual national holiday, both in the United States and in Canada. So let's dive a little bit into Thanksgiving. And this just shows that we did a textbook study of 28 textbooks in K through 12. And we did 2 studies. We revised the study in 2015 and initially studied in 2012. And these were the main topics that came up in those particular textbooks, those 28 textbooks. So Thanksgiving is one that we see, very often. And consistently there in the textbook. So this kind of just reaffirms what many of us have been saying. Okay. I'm going to skip that. So I'd like to dive into this particular cartoon. This Snoopy cartoon is currently both online and in an in-person exhibition that we have in Washington, D.C. called Americans, which explores sort of some of the pervasive imagery of American Indians throughout society and the media. And so this is an image of by Charles Schulz of Snoopy and Woodstock celebrating Thanksgiving. So we learn, as you mentioned, TV, Westerns, movies, cartoons at home, school. And for children, especially, some of these ideas that are formulated about American Indians can kind of get mixed up. And it can be hard to differentiate between what we watch on TV, what we read in a book or see in popular culture, especially when we see so many images similar to this of Native people. But we kind of miss the opportunity to hear from Native people themselves. So let's take a look at this. What about this cartoon that you're looking at? What is the element that is identifiably Native American?
The headdress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep, the headdress. Yep. So we see we see often feathers as a signifier of Indianness. And we see this here. And so it's kind of shorthand for this is an Indian, right? In a comic, this, this kind of visually grabs us and we can understand what, Charles Schulz is kind of setting up for us here. Often when we see representations of Native people, they're showing wearing this type of headdress. And while many Native nations do have feathered headdresses, particularly on the American plains, the northern plains, and some in the southern plains as well, that are made of eagle feathers. And, it's important to know that each feather would be earned by a person who earned those feathers to wear them. So not just anyone could wear a headdress. And even eagle feathers, each single one is earned. And they might be earned by showing generosity, valor, bravery, or another characteristic that's particularly deemed worthy in that community. They are earned, but yet here it is, it's about Thanksgiving. And the people who were at Thanksgiving, what we know of as Thanksgiving today, the gathering in 1621, wouldn't have worn a headdress like this. So in a way, this headdress that shown in this cartoon, it kind of erases, again, the diversity of Native culture. So, again, is this a false or incomplete narrative? Where does that lie? You think it's incomplete?
Can I say something?
Mm-hmm.
What it made me think of to kind of let students get a better understanding,
Mm-hmm.
it would be like somebody going to the trophy shop and getting their own trophy for themselves, or getting a ring made, but they were never, in a championship.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Just last weekend, I did this thing called a Tecumseh challenge. I was back in Oklahoma with my community and I earned it, but I kind of showed my son, and, he couldn't come with me this time. And he said, I don't want it even in my room because I didn't earn it. He wants to earn it himself. So I think that's a great example that you provide. And another one I've heard people say is a Purple Heart. It's kind of like wearing something that important, earning a trophy, taking a trophy you didn't earn and kind of showing that, or a Purple Heart. What can you imagine wearing something like that and not having earned it? So great example and connection to the classroom. Thank you. So, these kind of images can erase diversity and can be either false or incomplete. It's up to you to decide. And I would question if this is incomplete, if that's where you sit, I would ask, and if you use that with your students, I would ask them maybe what makes it complete.
Well, there are a couple of interesting comments in the chat about the popcorn. And I do think that the use of corn is something that is perhaps discussed when we're discussing this time period, maybe a bit inaccurately. And that may be represented by the popcorn in this picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's true that Native Americans, they found the oldest popcorn 10,000 years ago in the Valley of Tehuacan in Mexico. So Native people were developing popcorn and growing it widely and abundantly. So it's true that corn is, so maybe that is a little bit more of a little bit of the complete story, like it's not depicted in a complete way, but maybe that, maybe this fits in a little bit of incomplete because at least there is something that's a little bit accurate. I've been growing my own popcorn. I have some right up here in my garden. So yeah, it is an old food. Sophisticated agriculture was developed by Indigenous people here. Yeah. So going back to kind of this approach that we have, we've done this I'll just say that we've done this on site. We've never done this kind of workshop. We've kind of adapted it for online, but we've never really tried it quite like this. So I thank you for kind of working with us. Typically we have teachers, move things, the resources towards if they're false or incomplete or more complete. And it's really the conversations that we're having that I think help us to think more carefully about our resources. And this is something that many teachers have said they might even like to adapt for their own classroom with their students. So now I'm going to bring another technique that you might consider using with your students. We're going to look at this painting by J.L.G. Ferris. It's titled The First Thanksgiving, 1621. It says 1932. I think that's when it was published. I actually think I went back and I think it was painted earlier. I think it was in the 1800s. And this is one of a series of paintings, of 12 paintings that depict iconic events in US history. So let's do a visual thinking strategy called it's not called anything. It's called a visual thinking strategy. And what we're going to do is we'll use the chat to very simply, and maybe we can even unmic if that works for all of you. And I just want to pose a question. What's going on here? What is going on here? So, you can just observe what you're seeing. And one thing that can help with students is to focus their attention because there's a lot going on here. So I might ask you, choose if you're going to focus on the environment or the kind of the landscape and kind of dig in visually to what's going on there. Or maybe another third of you or so will focus really on the people. What are they wearing? How are they being depicted? So visually dive in there. And maybe another third of you might look at sort of some of the props and things that aren't quite the environment or landscape, but are the things in the painting. So go ahead and choose your focus, because I think it could be helpful for us to go deeper and may help with focusing your students as well, because there's an awful lot going on here. And after you've chosen your focus area, go ahead and just use the chat, or we can unmic and you can just share what you think is going on. And although I want to say that if you're going to share what you see is going on, try and mention what you see that makes you say that. So if you're going to say someone is helping another person, what do you see visually that makes you say that? So try and add a little more detail if you can. All right, let's see what we have in the chat.
Can I go ahead and speak? If I'm able to. Okay, what I'm seeing, my eyes first drawn to the colonial people in the middle, the man in the black and the woman in the dress. And she is serving, I don't know what she's serving to the Native peoples, but they are seated like children to me. And that to me looks like they're treated as a lesser group of people than those that are standing over them.
Yeah. Tell me more about what you see that makes you say that they seem like children or they look like children.
Well, at their eye level with the child and the dog. The child is eating what looks like the same food, or it looks like a cookie or something to me, in my opinion.
Yeah. Thanks for those observations. Yeah. Anybody else?
Now we have lots of things in the chat. The woman in the back seems to be directing the Native woman. So it might be this interaction here. You can see my pointer. Other things. Everyone seems to be talking and communicating regardless of the language barrier.
Yeah. So it makes us wonder, is there a language barrier? Because it appears maybe by body language that they're communicating.
The colonial woman is offering food to the kneeling indigenous people, and it makes it seems like she's doing them a favor.
So she's being depicted feeding them.
Fellowship, different groups of people and families coming together to share food and conversation. This is interesting. Benevolent whites, lady giving a move ahead gesture, woman serving, man waiting to serve. There are definitely different colonial social groups represented here as well.
Yeah. So these are really good observations, something that can spark inquiry. And, you know, I'm not going to provide a lot of answers to this. I think some of our resources that Bert will put in the chat and will help to provide some context to this, some more details. And so I think that should be helpful, but it's a good opportunity to really provide, I think, a little equity in our classroom, because there's really no wrong answer, right? Students are observing. So it's, you know, we do ask them sometimes for evidence so that they can use, you know, what do you see that makes you say that? It just helps provide a little more detail and has them practice some of that reasoning. But it is a good exercise. And of course, a critical voice is missing. So, you know, all of these images that we've seen, you know, this is an older one, but we see depictions throughout. We see like the Thanksgiving Snoopy movie. So this is one where there's a lot of visual representation, some false, some incomplete. And of course, the critical voice that we're missing is the Wampanoag people themselves. So unfortunately, there's no written record of the people who experienced that day from their perspective. There are other written letters out there that provide a little bit of context, although not a lot of detail either, but not from the Wampanoag. However, we do know, there's no doubt, that they lived in the lands around Massachusetts, what's now Massachusetts, for thousands of years and stewarded those lands and waters. Very well. So how can we then, if there's not a lot of written records, how can we counter some of these false or incomplete images and narratives that we've had? Well, there's several ways we can do that. This is just one picture from a blog. So we have a lot of blogs that can give background information. So providing these contemporary images of Wampanoag people today, and that's from 2011. And the blog was written in 2013. So that's a resource for you. On the right, you also see a lobster net. So people more likely did, eat corn. There was probably some corn being eaten perhaps there, and shellfish than turkey, and certainly not potatoes, because potatoes had not made their way up from South America yet. So the Inca, I believe, really developed the potato. So they hadn't arrived yet. And it's important to know that, again, the Wampanoag, had shellfish, and they also provided deer at Thanksgiving and many other foods. So we're seeing a really different view in that painting, right? It almost seems as if the Wampanoag are being hosted. So it's a very different kind of narrative than what we know actually happened. So through Native Knowledge 360 lessons and some suggested books, and we do have a one-page helpful handout. Bert, I might have forgotten to put that in the Run a Show, but it's on our website. Maybe you can find it for them. That provides some book suggestions and some other resources all in one place to improve teaching about Thanksgiving. So we want to, of course, show more women and children, and that these cultures are ongoing. So here's two other resources to tell more complete narratives. On the left is the American Indian Perspectives on Thanksgiving. It's a free teaching poster, and it looks at the hundreds of different ways. I mean, it doesn't look at hundreds, but there are hundreds of different ways that Native people give thanks throughout the year, and sometimes even in daily life. So it's organized around 4 different themes, community being one, and how Native people from different regions give thanks. So it's kind of providing that perspective rather than just that 1621 event that we're all pretty familiar with, although maybe we're not familiar with a more accurate story. And so how do we get to a more accurate story? How do we understand more of the actual details? Well, this backgrounder and this picture on the right is another free resource. It's a harvest ceremony study guide. And so it's a backgrounder for teachers. So that gives a lot of detail on the foods, how the Wampanoag society was and is. So it provides, it talks about some of the political alliances and context of the time period. So we think that that's a really nice and fairly short resource full of a lot of good information. So both of those are available to you on our website. And Bert probably put them in the chat already. So this may be a hard question kind of right now. But does anybody want to share an idea of how they might tell a more complete narrative about Thanksgiving? And I'm even realizing this might be a hard question right here, so I may have to change that down the road. Because maybe you haven't had a chance to go in and see these things. But maybe you have an idea or this sparks something for you.
Now that I have this source, can use that. But I've also already told my students that for some Native Americans, it's the National Day of Mourning.
Thank you.
They actually protest the Americanized Disney version of Thanksgiving and fast and really reflect on that day. So I would just add to what I've already told my students or what I tell my students as we get closer to November.
Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Jonathan. Appreciate that. That's a great point. Yeah, to provide those other perspectives. That's exactly what you're doing by sharing that. Yeah, that not everybody has the same a feeling about it, right? And then some people are even, vehemently opposed to it and don't consider it at all a day to celebrate. So it's important to share those different perspectives. Thank you.
I visited Plymouth Colonies, the original, where they reenact, and they gave us a lot of good resources, primary resources like from Governor Winthrop and things like that. So we had letters and journal entries to look at and see what really happened on that day.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that Edward Winslow letter is a real good primary source too. I think it's one of the few we have.
That's the one I meant. I'm sorry. And yes, and they even have it like it's rewritten in a way that the kids can understand it. It's not old English sounding. They have it two different ways.
Good. Yeah, Old English can be challenging. So that's great that they put those supports in. Great. Well, thank you for sharing. And I know maybe it's not a totally fair question. I see that now that, you might need time to go back and look at things and think more, but both of you just shared great examples. So thank you for that.
Can I share one more thing?
Yeah.
There's a book. It's like a picture book. It's called The Encounter.
Mm-hmm.
And it's told like from a Native American's experience, like when he's a boy to when he's older, and how the colonists came in and how he basically told everyone, okay, don't welcome them. And then he, at the end of the book, he's older, basically reflecting back on, I wish they would have listened to me. So I use that as well to show a different perspective of Thanksgiving, and that it wasn't like we see in the movies, a Disney-fied version.
Mm-hmm. That's great. What did you say the book was called?
It's called The Encounter, and it begins off when he's a little boy and he has a statue that he talks to, and that he's basically praying to, that, okay, so these men are looking at our gold. It can parallel with how when Christopher Columbus saw the gold and basically would cut people's hands off if they didn't find enough gold. So it could be, even though it's historical fiction, it could be paralleled with some primary sources. Mm-hmm. But it's called The Encounter.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan, do you know if that's written by Jane Yolen? Mm-hmm. Is that the correct book? Angie says that yes, it is. I am creating a list of all the resources for y'all that I'll share, and I'll put that on our list of resources. So thank you. Several people are saying that's the correct one. So thank you for sharing. That's awesome.
So I had before planned to show you even another resource and a whole other content area, but I think I figured out this morning that it's too much. And I think instead of, kind of doing this, going into our American Indian removal lessons, which I'm very excited that Colleen has agreed to dive into those with you at our second session. Instead, I'd like to kind of skip past that and just ask you, to reflect for a minute, because I think we kind of probably need to start tying this up a little. So let's think back to the session. Why is it important? And maybe you feel like you've already said it. But if you feel like you haven't, why is it important to tell more complete narratives about Indigenous people? Why are we doing this work? Why are we all here today? I'm just going to open up the chat and see what you have to say.
So first one here, so that we are sure our students understand that history is diverse and that there's never just one side to the story. So the stories do not get lost or rewritten inaccurately. A need to preserve all history, that all people and cultures should be valued because it's history, and we're doing a disservice to everyone that we don't talk about, with whom we don't talk about it completely. The most popular perspective isn't always the most accurate, and I miss somebody's up here. Let's see. So that stories do not get lost or rewritten accurately. Oh no, maybe that's something to tell the complete story. And human Indigenous people for our students. That's the one I missed. The value of the stories of Indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
And they keep coming.
So students can see themselves in our past.
Love that one.
Mm-hmm. This is really great. I mean, all of these are fantastic and you all say it very well. And I think add to a fuller picture of why it's so important. And so we, you know, I just want to take a moment to thank you because you're committed and I appreciate your time for being here. And you know, hopefully this is weighted in a way that isn't overwhelming. I mean, we were really kind of looking critically at some things, skills which are really important for your students, but I hope you feel supported, and in subsequent sessions that you'll feel more and more supported on what to do and new resources that can really help you. So I agree with all of the things you said about why it's important, and really, you know, appreciate everything you do to tell more complete narratives, because it can be, you know, extra work. Like, you know, sometimes you have to go back and go back to our website and find something, or so we hope that this supports you, but also that it supports Native kids in the classroom too, Native and non-Native kids who deserve, you know, to hear more about our story as, you know, American people. And so, you know, sometimes this invisibility can make people feel devalued. And so this is really important work that actually affects, you know, society. It affects the kids in your classroom. And I just want to thank you for this legacy work that you do every day in the classroom, because it really does impact society. So thank you for that. And it just, you know, we're not really getting into as many contemporary Native issues, but I think that morning example is a good one. But teaching students accurate Native history is not enough to break through, you know, years of this invisibility and stereotypes that we've been fed through some of the ways that we saw, and that perpetuate bias and racism. So it's really important to teach about contemporary Native issues, to take that from history to make it what's happening today with Native people. What are the issues that people have? What are they doing about the land? What are they doing about their language, their culture, their businesses? You know, how are they part of society today? And also the great contributions of Native people. So this was from a report that really looked at, it was a study done in 2018 that really looked at, revealed that for the first time how Americans, the American public views Native Americans and representation in public schools. So I feel like you all have done a lot already and shared a lot of ideas. So I won't ask you to share one more action unless you really feel inspired to do so. Or maybe it's a new question that you have that you want to explore. So if you'd like to, you're welcome to add that to the chat. One new question or action you feel inspired. And if not, that's absolutely fine. I want to thank you again. I'm going to skip through that. You will be in your next session working with my colleague, Colleen Smith, and maybe one of us, maybe Bert or I will be able to help in the chat if she needs that. And you'll be diving into, I should have put a slide up of that session. That date will be coming soon, right, Kay? We'll figure that out.
Yes.
Yeah, for session 2. And so I just want to thank you. That is a screenshot of our website. And thank you again from me to you. I will stop screen share, pause, share. There we go. Stop share. And again, sending you away. Thanks so much for your time. Hope that you'll do some evaluation. Again, this is the first time we've done this. So we sort of put different sessions together, but are working on that round circle that you saw, and hope that becomes, you know, as we refine it, a worksheet that you might use some of this in your own classroom with students. So yeah.
So Renee, do you want them, if they have not completed that pre-survey, to go ahead and do that at this time? I can put that on that agenda for them to do.
You know, it's cool because the link will work. So what I might ask them to do is do the post survey. So the survey.
Are they the same link?
It's the same link, and they'll just get now post survey.
All right.
Yeah,
so
that'd be really helpful.
I will add that at the bottom of that page that I gave them. Everything that Bert put in the chat, I just kind of cut and pasted and put in one place for them. And I shared that with them so that they can use that as a frame of reference.
Great. Thank you, Kay, for doing that.
You're
Thank
very
you
welcome.
all.
Thank you. I think this has been very interesting, and it's given some rise to some thoughts that perhaps we haven't had before. And as Renee said, we've got several other sessions that are at least one other session that we're working on that's going to give you go into this a little bit more in depth and give you even more resources. So we hope that we're really excited about this opportunity to collaborate with the educators there at the Smithsonian, and we're so thankful for you all to be here for us today. Don't forget to tweet, and I will repost that agenda link because someone is asking, they missed it. Any questions or anything that you all there's that link again to that agenda with all of the resources, and at the bottom of that page, the very last thing is the survey that Renee has asked us to complete. If you will complete the post survey at this time for them, because you're using that, correct, Renee, to fine tune this presentation for other teachers as you move forward. And so we can assist them in doing, I don't know that you could improve upon it too much. I think you did a fantastic job tonight, but we want to assist you in any way we can.
Thanks. That feedback would be really helpful. Even as I was giving it, I said, oh, I need to fine tune that or change that, or yeah. And it was just too much to do American Indian removal too, because I think those lessons really deserve a dive in. And so we're fine tuning how long all of this takes and that kind of thing. But I really appreciate everybody's engagement and this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Well, I will say that we will stay on here for a few more minutes if you have any questions or anything that you would like to discuss with us. Otherwise, I have posted our sign-in sheet in the chat. If you need that, let me know and I'll repost that. And we will see you the next time. And I will stop recording now.